the Love 146 story is a great example of the structure of these things, but you worked on the ground all across Southeast Asia. Talk to us about some of the conditions of the people living in these places you toured, in brothels, but also just orphanages and in general.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I'll try to paint a picture with my words if it's possible. One of the most, I would say, defining moments of the trip that, to sort of give context, my husband had a business. At that point, we were both working in it because we were young parents like you are right now. And it was easier for me to help my husband and make my own hours than to be practicing law 3,000 hours a year and never see my child. So we'd had this business, and in 2013 we sold it. And my daughter was 8 years old at that point, and we yanked her out of third grade, and we started traveling. And we began in Australia and New Zealand, but we ended up in Southeast Asia. And one day we were in Cambodia, and we had signed up for a tour of a lake. There's a lake in the middle of Cambodia called Tonle Sap Lake, and it's the largest freshwater lake in the region, although define freshwater because during their dry season, it's 10 to 12 feet deep in brown, murky, muddy water. It's like a giant mud pond. And our guide put us in a canoe, and we paddled out to these houseboats. But I say houseboat, and your listeners are probably thinking Lake Mojave, Lake Powell houseboat. This was more like Mark Twain, like, lashed together pieces of rotting wood with a little ramshackle kind of wood hut perched on top of it. And when the typhoons come or any natural disaster comes, it wipes out families in the region. They get flooding and whatnot. But sometimes a kid or two will escape. So then they're orphans. And there's this orphanage that sits on this floating wooden platform where all of these kids who no longer have parents due to some natural disaster live all day long, 24/7 in the middle of Tonle Sap Lake with their teachers also on board. And we get out in this canoe with our guide to visit the orphanage, and we step out, and we walk into very impoverished, surroundings. There's PVC plastic barrels, in the corner, and we go, "What's that?" And they're like, "Oh, that's the water we drink." And I'm like, "Where does it come from?" And they're like, "Out of the lake." And let me tell you, if you saw the color of the lake, you'd be like, "Oh my gosh," right? And I'm like, "Okay, wow, like, do you boil it or like what?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, we try to let it sit out, and we, try to boil it." And I said, "Okay." And then they're like, "And just to give you some idea, because you're from America, the kids drink the water out of the lake, they go to the bathroom in the lake, they wash their clothes in the lake, and they eat the fish out of the lake." And I'm like, "Oh, wow, all right, got it." And then, we walk into this classroom, and there's kids that are my daughter's age, and it looks like there's calculus on the whiteboard. Very interesting. So they're doing way higher math than any American classroom I've seen in elementary school. And my daughter eventually makes a little friend, despite the fact that she doesn't speak a word of Cambodian, and the Cambodian girl doesn't speak any English. And they're palling around, and apparently a prior tourist the week before had given the little girl a packet of hair dye. So she had a little pink streak in her hair, and she wanted to see it. So I took a picture with my cell phone, and I turned it around, and I don't think that little girl had ever seen any picture of herself or a mirror or anything. Like, this was her first time seeing an image of her. And there she and my daughter are. And there's a picture, I think, of them in the book. I included about 20 color photos in my book so that people could actually start to see, not just hear, but see what the world is like outside their bubble and their zone. And, they're fast friends, and they're palling around. And at the end, I look at the tour guide, and I said, "Look, she was really entranced with her picture. Why don't I shoot you a copy? Do they have cell phones?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, I can send a copy to your cell phone." He goes, "I don't have a cell phone either." And I'm like, "Oh, well, I guess I could go back to the hotel and maybe print out a color copy and mail it to you." And he goes, "We don't have mail." And I mean, just the basic things that, even when you're not trying really hard to not be biased and prejudiced and have your first world perceptions in place, the rug is just ripped out from underneath you. So we're getting ready to get back in the canoe that we paddled out to this floating barge on. And I'm helping my daughter from the bigger platform, stepping down into the little canoe, and my husband pulls at the clothing on my elbow, and he's like, "Turn around. She's going to say it again." And I'm like, what? And I was kind of pissed off at my husband because I'm like, look, I don't want my kid to fall into the breach between, the orphanage and the floating canoe. She's like 8. I'm trying to get her safely from one to the other. And so I turned very brusquely back to him. I'm like, honey, what? Like, just leave me alone. I'm trying to get, our daughter in, basically. And he goes, stop. You need to look at what I'm saying. She's going to say it again. And he points in the direction of a tinier canoe that's barely afloat and holding water that has sidled up alongside our canoe, which I'd not seen. And in this threadbare canoe is a woman who looks twice my age, but upon further inspection is probably exactly my age. But she's been living in the hot Cambodian sun with no shelter for like her entire life. So she looks like she's 60 and not 38 or whatever. And in front of her is a toddler, like maybe a 1.5-year-old baby girl who's got really no clothing on at all. And the woman's barely got clothing on. And the baby is standing at the end of the canoe sucking on a bottle of dirty lake water. And this woman looks at me, like looks into my freaking soul. And then she yanks her gaze away from me, looks at my daughter, who is dressed, for the record, head to toe in pink and white, which were her favorite colors in 3rd grade, of course. And we're not rich. I mean, I'm not, we're comfortable middle class at the time, and maybe not so comfortable, like depending on whether our business was doing good or not good that month. But we're certainly not starving, right? And she looks back at me after looking at my daughter with a very appraising stare. And she points at her baby at the end of the boat or at the end of her canoe. And she goes, $1,000 you take? And I hear my daughter gasps and she goes, and she leans over to me and she goes, Mama, did she just offer to sell her baby to you? And the woman repeats it. She looks at my daughter and back at hers and she goes, $1,000 you take? And I just got to say, Greg, thank God I didn't have $1,000 that day or I would have bought a child. And categorically, hands down, that is not the answer to the poverty or slavery problem in 3rd world countries, especially when you get back to LAX with an extra kid that you don't have a passport for. But we were just heartbroken. We cried. My whole family, my husband, me, my daughter took turns crying on and off the entire rest of the day. And you realize very easily at that point that there, but for the grace of God, go you and your child. I was born in California. That was a luck of the draw thing. I could have just as easily been born in the middle of Cambodia and had this woman's life. And before we demonize parents that we really don't understand, and I say that now having worked for 10 years in 3rd world war, war-torn countries, before we go demonizing these parents who are asking to sell their baby to a tourist, or when they fail to sell their baby to me, then they turn around and sell their baby to a brothel. You have to realize the reason they're freaking doing that, the reason they're selling their child is because if they don't, that kid will starve. And so will all of their other 8 children starve to death this year. Because guess what? They don't have birth control either. So, it's very, very easy to walk into these countries and think, oh, how dare these sex traffickers sell these children? And how dare these mama-sons sit and babysit these girls waiting for pedophiles to come in and rape the girls? And how dare these parents sell their children to the brothels? But you don't know what it's like until you've lived their life. And even I, working side by side in these circumstances now, still don't truly understand what that is like. That mama-san that I used to think was part of the problem, I got news for your viewers. She's a girl who didn't die. She's a girl whose mother was so poor that she couldn't sell that 8-year-old or that 2-year-old to a brothel. So she sold that baby to a brothel. And instead of dying by the pimp or the trafficker, or dying by a violent John or pedophile who strangled her to death during the sex act, or dying from AIDS or syphilis that went to her brain, she just kept living. She kept living. And now she's 24 and no pedophile wants her, and she can't go home because once you've been sold to a brothel, even though your family's the one who sold you, you're considered to be damaged goods, and you can't go back to the small hut in the small town, if you can even call it that, in Laos or Cambodia, where you hail from. And so there she is with no skills, no way out, in a brothel, and she becomes the babysitter for the girls that the pedophiles do want. And so you go to these places and you come home to your middle class suburban lifestyle after 6 months. We were there almost a half year. in these regions, and you walk in your back door, and I keep a fairly clean house. I mean, my surfaces are clean. I'm not chock-a-block full of tchotchkes in every corner. And my husband and I walked into our living room, looked around our house in Orange County, and we're like, "Are you feeling it?" And he's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "We need to take truckloads of this stuff out of our house because we don't need anything." And the actual reality is the only thing you need is water, a little bit of food, probably about 1/30th of the food you and I eat in America. And if you're living in a tropical environment like the one I just described, you don't even need clothing and shelter. That's it. And you come home and you intrinsically understand. And my daughter understood. She would say things like 10 months later, like, "Hey, Mom, my backpack's got a hole. I need a new backpack." And I'd look at her and I'd go, "Do you need it or do you want it?" And she'd smile and she'd go, "No, it's a want. I don't need it." And she walked off. And no amount of lecturing your kids about how privileged they are to have 3 square meals a day does the lesson the way standing in a canoe watching a mother sell her baby or try to sell her baby to your parents does. My child has a very level head on her, and it's because she's been to the killing fields of Cambodia at age 8. She knows where communism goes. She knows you'll be a skull washing up 50 years later in a place called the killing fields if you let a communist overthrow take over your government. And no, she is not, at now age 18, one of the 51% of the youth who are surveyed in college who think it would be cool to live in a communist or socialist country. My child knows exactly where that leads. And I would urge your viewers, and this was a very long answer and I'm going to shut up now. I would urge your viewers to knock off the Disneyland trip this Thanksgiving or December vacay, or your Grand Canyon trip next summer, and buy a one-way plane ticket to Cambodia and take your children where I accidentally took my child and worried I was going to need to buy her 10 years of therapy. And in fact, I needed to buy her no therapy. And what it did was make her a very grateful, well-adjusted child who gets it. We need to actually show ourselves and our family and even our children how the rest of the world lives, because that is, you can't fix a problem you don't know about, and you can't be grateful for a life you've never stepped outside of for a second.
Well said. And of course, child brothels and sex trafficking is probably the darkest application of human trafficking and slavery. But I've heard you talk in other interviews about the wider scope of forced labor camps, of young boys being worked to death on fishing and shrimping boats, lithium mining. What more can you say about just the wider scope of human trafficking, human enslavement, and what regions and industries are most to blame?
Human trafficking is a huge problem. To just set the stage for the answer, it's 150 billion with a B, $1 billion a year industry, 40 million with an M people are currently enslaved. To give your viewers some idea of the scope of that, I live in California. We've got almost 40 million people in my state. So it's like waving a magic wand, or an evil wand, if you will, overnight, and having every single person in California chained to a bed, being raped 10 times a night by pedophiles for profit, or stuck in a mine in Africa mining the minerals that go into your cell phone and your Tesla battery, right? And it is a huge, huge problem. And we need to stay away from comparing our pain to other people's pain or conditions to other conditions. It's all ugly. I mean, I personally think that if you had to ask me which human trafficking context I would least like to be in, it would be a 3-year-old being raped by grown men night after night, 10 times a night in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Like, yeah, to me, that you just don't get much worse than that. But it's no walk in the park to be a 17-year-old man who is not recognized because you're one of the hill tribe. You're not a member of the Thailand community. You're not a member of the Laotian community. You're not considered a citizen of that country, or you're part of the caste system in India, right? And you're persona non grata. You may as well be chattel. And you ended up on a shrimping boat in the ocean off of Thailand, and you're literally worked to death. And by that, I mean you're working 19 hours a day, sleeping a few hours a night, doing back-breaking, brutal work until you die. I mean, they just work until they die.
Can you believe it, people? A video clip and a peek into how that sweet THC sausage is made. For some people, I'm sure it's nice to put a face to the name, so I started making clips that are a little more YouTube friendly than the full show tends to be. get the full show on any podcasting platform. I prefer to keep it audio only, so we have a more decentralized distribution for a controversial show, and also so I can edit out the ums and ahs and barking dogs and all the things that happen when a person records in their home environment. And then if you really like the show, you can sign up for THC Plus, and instead of 1 hour interviews, you get the full 2 hour interview for just $8. I think that's a better deal, more of a win-win than asking you to support the show by booking a therapy session or buying generic Viagra. It's getting weird out there, folks. So just go to the highersidechats.com or click the link at the top of any set of show notes, and all your wildest dreams will come true. All right? All right.
The Higherside Chat Show, Greg Carwood and Company.